Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, which is sponsoring this webinar. We're going to wait just a few more minutes to allow the rest of our attendees to log on, and then we'll get started in just 2 or 3 minutes. So sit tight, and I'll be back with you in just a couple of minutes. Okay, hi again, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, which is sponsoring this webinar. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. And on the last slide, you'll see some information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar if you're not already an LSA member. So we're very excited to present this webinar on Mastering the Art of the Linguistics podcast, and we're grateful to our panelists for taking the time to participate. I'd like to take just a few moments to let you know how the webinar will work and to make sure that you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel. You may have noticed that your microphones are muted. This is so we don't get a lot of miscellaneous background noise from attendees like dogs barking or traffic or whatever. You will have the chance to ask questions during the webinar. You should see a questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and you can ask a question there at any time during the webinar. I'll forward those to the panelists, and they will answer your questions. If your question is for a specific panelist, please specify which one. Then finally, before I turn the floor over to our panelists, I'd like to take a few seconds to run a brief poll past you about your experience with public-facing linguistics activities like podcasts, interviews with the news media, online courses, op-eds, and things like that. I'll start the poll in a moment, and if you can take just a few seconds to answer it, I'll go ahead and share the results with everyone. Here comes the poll. So if you can just take a moment to answer your level of experience with this kind of activity, and we'll share the results with everybody once you've voted. Okay, we'll just leave the poll open for a few more seconds. All right, looks like almost everybody has voted, so I'm going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results with everybody, so you should be seeing this on your screen. Very few of you are actually pros with this kind of activity. About half of you are beginners, and the rest have some experience. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. would like to turn the floor over to our panelists. Each panelist is going to speak briefly about their own podcast, sharing their inspirations, their best practices, and their experiences. And after all the panelists have spoken, there'll be time for question and answer. So first up is Anne Curzan. She's Geneva's Smitherman Collegiate Professor of English, Linguistics, and Education, and Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan. And last but not least, a featured expert on Michigan Public Radio's That's What They Say. And I should also mention that Anne is going to have to, she'll stay as long as she can, but she is going to have to step away early from the webinar because she has a meeting on campus about COVID-19 related issues. So with that, Anne, please take it away, and I'll get your slide up here in a minute.
Thank you, David, and I'm delighted to be here. I thought I'd talk for just a few minutes about where the podcast came from and a few takeaways from my experience doing it. The podcast, That's What They Say, we've been going for 7.5 years now, so I've had a good chance to learn some things along the way. And I thought I'd actually start with a comment that I met a woman a couple of years ago who heard my voice and then said, I know your voice, and then had that moment where she said, you don't look like what I thought you'd look like, which is often people's response if they've only heard your voice. But she said, I've been listening to you for a few years on the radio, and I have realized that what you're telling me is that I should just chill out about language a little bit. And I thought, that is actually exactly what I'm telling you, except that I never in any one podcast say, could everybody just chill out about language a little bit? That what instead I'm doing is 4 minutes at a time, and my podcast is 4 minutes every Sunday morning. I'm trying to help people think about language change and linguistic diversity as part of language, so that if they keep listening every week, they'll be getting that message through all the specific examples that we're using. So That's What They Say is on Michigan Radio, which is a local affiliate of National Public Radio. It is 4 minutes. It goes on at 9:35 on Sunday mornings, and it runs as an alternate to Will Shortz's Puzzle. So Will Shortz is on at 8:35 and 10:35, and I'm the local programming that's on at 9:35. And what's relevant particularly about that is that the radio station does want me to keep it in the spirit of the puzzle. So they want it to be quote unquote Sunday morning fare. It's supposed to be fun and accessible. So I'm always trying to balance how to do some of the, for me, more serious messaging that I want to do, but do it in a way that feels accessible and a little bit lighter. I am trying to help people think differently about language, about variation, about change, and also about the nature of usage rules. That's something I've spent a lot of my career thinking about, the history of those rules and people's notions about right and wrong. So let me just share 4 big takeaways, and then I'll turn it over and happy to answer questions later. The first takeaway would be that if you're not excited to talk about it on a podcast, you shouldn't be broadcasting about it. I think that I try to make sure every Sunday when whatever I'm talking about, that there's some nugget, there's some message that I'm really excited to share. People can hear that in your voice as to whether this is something you're passionate about and excited about. So if you haven't found that nugget that you think is worth sharing, then you got to keep searching. And I'm thinking about, we now get a lot of listener questions, so I'm often trying to find answer to something a listener's written in about. And we had a listener write in about mull versus mull over. And they said, I just can't believe people are now mulling things. I can only mull over things. And they were, of course, quite upset about that. And I was looking at that, and I went back into the history of these words, and it turns out that actually, unsurprisingly, if you're a linguist, to mull something and mull over something are equally old. And so the question gave me a chance to talk with people not only about the history of mull and mull over, but also about the recency illusion. And to say, you know, the fact that you've just noticed people say mull something doesn't actually mean that it's new, doesn't actually mean that it's wrong. So that gave me an excuse to talk about that. So the second takeaway would be, and I'm sure the other panelists are going to talk about this, that you do need to streamline the information into shorter bits. That's one of the jobs of doing these kinds of podcasts, I think. This is a valuable skill to be able to take complicated things and streamline them. I would say, though, that I don't think that that means that you have to, quote unquote, simplify them. I think there's a difference between streamlining and simplifying, that even as you streamline, you can recognize for people where there's complexity, even if you can't dive into it. And then you can decide, where do I want to nuance a point, nuance an explanation, and where am I going to say, this is a little bit simplified, but here's one way to think about it. So I always want to make sure that I feel like my linguist colleagues could listen to what I'm saying, feel that it was accurate, even if they can see that I've chosen not to dive into the complexities of something. And one example there, we had a listener who wanted to hear about the existential there is with plural. So for example, there's examples everywhere, which is very common in speech, often gets edited out of writing. There are studies about this, for example, by Bill Crawford. So, I had 4 minutes, so I'm saying, okay, there's this existential there. Let me very briefly explain what that is. Very quickly explain the idea that the noun phrase governs agreement, so that the there doesn't govern it. Very quickly give a couple highlights from Bill Crawford's study, and then conclude, which shows that theirs plus plural is very common in speech. And then just conclude with something about writing versus speech. I did not dive into all of Bill Crawford's results, didn't have time, and it wasn't the one point that I wanted to make about that construction. The third takeaway that I feel really strongly about is to think about the beliefs that people are going to be bringing to the material and to the podcast, and to think about how to address those. People have strong beliefs about language. They have strong beliefs about what's right and wrong. I don't want to dismiss those as being silly or stupid. I often say this, it is a terrible way to start a conversation, to say to someone, you are being silly, and then try to explain something to them. They don't think they're being silly. They believe things that they have learned in school, that they've learned from their family, and to take that seriously and then think, how can I ask somebody to rethink something that they think they know, they think that they understand? And one of the examples here, which now I think people are rethinking some, is singular they. And I've been talking about singular they for over 25 years and honing my argument about singular they. And what I came to at some point was that I needed to help people see what they could debate and what they couldn't debate, because I was often getting stuck with people where we were debating whether or not they could be singular. And I finally got to the point where I would say to people, look, we can have a debate about this, but the debate is not whether it can be singular, because it is, and explain what I mean by that. What we can debate is whether or not we're allowed to write that down. And that helped people see that there was something they'd learned of that it wasn't okay to do, and that we could debate that, but it wasn't whether they could or could not be singular. And as part of this, I also always try to acknowledge my own peeves about language, the things that I notice in the language that I wish were not the way the language was changing, but then to help people see, I own that peeve, I don't correct other people, I acknowledge I have no good grounds, but sure, it's aesthetically, it might be something I don't like. And the last takeaway would be patient. I know I'm doing this 4 minutes at a time. Some folks have longer podcasts, but my theory on this is, if I can even open the door a crack to convince people that there is a reasonable alternate view about how to think about something, that they think, I don't agree with Anne, but I can see where she's coming from, that's fine. That if I can just open that door and bit by bit help people think that maybe language change is something that they could enjoy, maybe slang is creativity that they could celebrate, that just opening that door crack is enough to help people start to rethink some of what they think they know about language. So I will stop there and turn it over.
Hi. There's my first slide. So I'm Carrie Gillen. I'm the co-host of the Vocal Fries, and we're the podcast about linguistic discrimination. So every 2 weeks, we put out an episode that's approximately an hour long. 45 minutes of it approximately is us interviewing someone most of the time. Sometimes it's just the two of us, but mostly we interview someone who's actually the expert on whatever topic we're talking about. And the reason why we decided to do that is because we didn't want to talk about things that were sort of like outside of our experience. So our first episode was about vocal fry, and because we're both women, we felt like we could talk about it, even though like in terms of content, it was not really either of our areas of expertise. But when it comes to, say, Black English, we didn't feel like we were the ones who could talk about it, so we had to have guests. And then 15 minutes at the beginning is us just talking about something in the news that's recent about language, and it's a lot of us ranting sometimes in fun ways. We're trying to be fun and light. That's, we're trying to be not super academic, even though we're talking about super academic things. Yeah, so that's our podcast. Maybe you can switch slides. So I thought Anne's takeaways were really, really good. I think I'll just sort of add to them. So again, yes, absolutely, you have to be excited. So, I mean, I have always been excited to tell people, hey, it's not okay to be an asshole about language. That's our tagline, don't be an asshole. So it's really easy for us to get really excited for whatever we're going to talk about, and we never have people on that we don't want to talk to, that we think won't be interesting or have something interesting to say. Or, and this is something that's important to us, we didn't want to have people on who would say harmful things about other groups of people, because our whole point is being a jerk about language is really just being racist or sexist or some other thing, and so we don't want to play into that. And of course, we probably have, but we really try not to. So you should think about how long you want your podcast to be. Some people love super long podcasts. There are podcasts out there that are 5 hours long. Some people like really short ones, so 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We felt like we needed the space to really talk about things and also to joke around, and so we really wanted to use more time. And since podcasting is whatever you want it to be, basically, we decided to use that. But it can help you be more creative if you shorten things. So it's kind of a push and pull. So I always try to make sure we're at least under an hour. There have been some exceptions because the topics were so difficult and just needed more air time. But that's just something to keep in mind. And yeah, so we kind of like Anne, we also admit, hey, look, we've done all these things that we're complaining about. Everything that we're saying is not an okay thing to do about language, to judge people for using X or Y. We've done it too, because both of us grew up in certain types of families with certain types of educational experiences. So that's, of course we did this. And so it doesn't make you a bad person as long as once you stop. So that's like how we handle that. And I think I've admitted that I do have language fees. I never say what they are because I don't really want to get into an argument about them. And also, like, there are certain vocal characteristics that I don't like, but for me to complain about them would be extremely hypocritical. But to admit that we have them, I think, is important. And yeah, so we just try to keep it light as much as we can. And enjoy ourselves. Like, I think actually, if you're going to do this, because there's not that much money in it, make sure you really want to do it and it's going to bring you some kind of value. So for me, it's the entertainment. Like, it's really fun to new people. I've talked to so many more people through this podcast than I ever did as a professor. So that's really great. Anyway, I will turn it to Michelle.
Hi there. Get the video. There we go. How are you guys doing today? Can't answer. Sorry. So the podcast that I co-host is called Subtext. And it's about the language of online dating. We recently became a member of Lyceum, which I'm super excited about. So I have to say thank you so much, Anne and Carrie. Your takeaways have been really fantastic. So ultimately, I'm going to probably echo a lot of what you said. But the first thing that I'm going to say is exactly what I'm doing right now. I have a tendency to talk way too fast. And I find that when we're recording our podcast, I have to slow down, and therefore always have notes and always have pacing. And I also have a co-host who very helpfully nudges me to slow down. With that slowed down pace, our podcasts are typically about 15 to 25 minutes. And the format, well, we have two formats, similar to Carrie's podcast. There's two of us, so we can always make conversation there. But we often bring in a guest who's going to talk about what their experiences are, and often their pet peeves. But a lot of what we focus on is online dating, which is an incredibly emotionally vulnerable space for people for, I think, obvious reasons. So one thing, in addition to what everyone else has said, is we take an approach of radical empathy. People, actually, this really is something that both Anne and Carrie have said, that like people have opinions about language. People have opinions about what's right and what's wrong. And nowhere do you see that more clearly spelled out than when people are online dating. Those first few messages are like ripe for judgment. It's kind of amazing. And a lot of what we say is, you are completely welcome to have your own feelings about language. It doesn't make it right or wrong. There's no magic amount of timing. There's no magic number of emojis. But if someone's language patterns are making you uncomfortable, it may be a red flag. And what I mean by that is that we often have people come on the podcast who are talking about their experiences with somebody, and they're not talking about the language choices at all. So a recent example of an episode that hasn't aired yet is a woman was talking to us about the fact that this guy that she matched with used emojis. And she was like horrified about the fact that he was using emojis in these first messages. And when we kind of pressed her on it, she said that other people had used emojis before and she was completely fine with it. So there was some other cues that she was picking up on that she couldn't identify. But all they had were these text messages, but there was just something else about his profile or about his messages. So a lot of what we end up talking about in the podcast is, you know, the thing that you think you're responding to should not become a rule. Like the next person that she matches with, if they use an emoji, she shouldn't rule them out, you know, just because we have this rule about emojis, which, you know, was this moment for her. She's like, oh yeah, I guess it's not actually the language that's upsetting. It's something else. So the first takeaway is to have this like radical empathy for people and where they're coming from, because they're all starting from somewhere else. The second thing that I think really, really helps us is to have your research prepared. So I brief my co-host, who also does all of the editing, about what we're going to talk about. But I don't tell her the like big reveal. I don't tell her the like big linguistic thing I just tell her the big linguistic thing we're going to get into, but not like how it's going to, the big reveal at the end, the big thing I want everyone to take away. And the reason for that is I want her reactions to be more authentic. Radiolab also does not pre-script, but we're also working with a longer format. So those reactions are more authentic. But for my side of it, I have my research prepared. I know the bullet points that I'm going to want to touch on, even when we're talking with a guest. We have our guests fill out a short intake form about what they're going to talk about, just so I know what research I should find. And the last thing that I think is a really important takeaway is to make it accessible. And one big, and this has kind of been touched on, but just kind of echoing this a little bit, making it accessible for me often means telling people, okay, I'm going to introduce the term. This is the term. This is what that term means. This is the term again. And the best example I have of this is of something called warranting, which warranting in a psychology sense means giving details that attach you to the real world. This is obviously not a linguistic term, but it's a term that makes you into a real person. And it's not a term that most people use. It's not common language. So when introducing it, I say, oh, there's a term for this. There's a term for this behavior that you're looking for or that you're performing. It's called warranting. Warranting means connecting your online life to your real life and making you more trustworthy. And then I, use it again. It took us a little while to figure out to really start introducing those terms, because some of the earliest feedback we got was, you guys are going too fast and introducing too much new stuff too quickly. But I also know that our audience is not particularly language people. We did a survey of our listeners a while back, and almost all of them are people who are, really interested in language, but they are not linguists. They are there because they are in the throes of online dating, and just want to have more clarity about it. And finally, I think that using that hook of connecting language to something that people are participating in, that everyone is participating in, has really helped us in developing the podcast, because it's not like I don't have to come up with topics on my own. The topics arise organically because so many people are online dating, which makes them very aware of their language. All of those hours that people spend anxiously composing messages are perfect material for our podcast. So that's about all that I have, and I will turn it over to John.
John, are you there?
I'm right here.
Yep, there you go.
It's interesting that the three eminent people before me have really said everything that I would say. I can only provide glosses on those things, but in doing my show, I have noticed, like Anne has, that a lot of my feedback over the past, it's been about 4 years, has been that I have somehow opened people's eyes up to the follies of prescriptivism. And as with Anne, that's not something that I generally say outright. And when I agreed to do the show, I wasn't thinking that that was my general mission. But of course, it is my mission in the background. But the way that I try to do it is just by teaching one lesson after another that are nominally about other things, but where you can't help but notice that general message. And I think that that ends up being particularly effective, because one could master a certain art of saying right at the beginning, I want to teach you not to think of any form of language as better, and here's why. But I worry, as I'm sure all of us do, that many people immediately feel defensive when you say that, because language is personhood, and there are things that your teacher told you, that your parents told you. If you mastered this sort of thing, which probably makes you more likely to listen to the podcast that we do, you're kind of proud that you did. And so for somebody to tell you that these rules don't really have as much behind them as you might think, comes off as an offense. And we might wish that it weren't that way, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to stay that way. But I find that if we just do what we do, then it's kind of like the drip, drip, drip of Chinese water torture. Gradually, the message gets across. And I think that the podcasting format does that better than any book could, because let's face it, there are now decades of books that are getting across the anti-prescriptivist message very, very well. And I think we can say that we were all very frustrated until about 10 minutes ago that those books never seemed to have any effect. I suspect that podcasting has more of an effect because you're kind of whispering into people's ears just a little bit week after week after week, and the message gets through. Whereas if somebody spent 10 days going through a book, it didn't work as effectively. And so I think that the anti-prescriptive message is very important in what we do, but it especially seems to work if you go at it diagonally. Another thing that really interested me about what Anne said is that, yeah, you gotta love it. You have to love what you're talking about. Any topic that I do on Lexicon Valley is something that comes from my gut. It has to be something that I happen to find interesting that week. That's exactly how I come up with my topics. If I've been walking around, I hear somebody say something and I think to myself, you know, that actually ties into this larger issue. Why don't I do that on the show? Because I've always found it interesting. I'll be paging through that quarter's issue of Language. And of course, 99.9% of it is the sort of thing that, you know, should be shot on site if anybody tries to bring it into a podcast. It's data that nobody but us wants. But there'll be some little bit, and I'll think, wow, that's really interesting. And you could translate that into something that, you know, the person on the street, quote unquote, would be interested in. At a party, someone will put something in a certain way, and I'll just file it away. Sometimes I'll even write it on my phone. Use that. That's something interesting. But it has to be something that really grabs me, at least, in the gut. And so that means that, you know, it's at the point, I can't believe it, I'm about to lay down the 100th episode that I've done of Lexicon Valley. There's some topics that haven't really come up because they just don't happen, you know, often for visceral reasons, to interest me. For example, I don't do computational. I'm a little too old, and it's just not my orientation. If I started linguistics now, I would not be doing computational. And I regret that in a way, because I like to think of Lexicon Valley as covering a wide swath of territory. But when it comes to computational linguistics, I think it's wonderful. I can tell that it's where linguistics is going. And it's the first time that I'm looking at the development of linguistics and thinking, wow, I'm going to just have to, you know, have my hair go gray and wave in salutation at that, because that's just not what I'm going to do. So things like that. Or, for example, and I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but emojis. You know, Michelle was talking about emojis. Those little faces and eggplants and piles of poop, I understand the appeal. I get that they are pragmatic markers. They're great. But maybe I've had a few too many student papers about them. I don't want them. And so I really should do a Lexicon Valley episode about emojis. It would probably, you know, get a wide listenership, but I don't have it in me. And so that is definitely something that one needs to have. You have to have that light in the gut. And yes, listeners pick up on it, that you are excited, and that seems to be something that they like. And then, as far as doing a weekly podcast goes, I find that in general, if one is trying to get things across to the public, I'm always doing a mental exercise of trying to remember what it was like to be a baby, so to speak, because it can be so hard to remember what is actually opaque. And so, of course, you don't say phoneme, because we all remember that that was interestingly tricky to master, but all sorts of things. You can't say dependent clause. You know, most people don't know what you mean by that. You can't say syntax, frankly, or you've got to be very careful, because what the general public thinks syntax is something from 5th grade, as opposed to what we know it is, which is something very, very different. And so often my sense is, and I think opinions will differ on this, but my sense is not only to introduce the terminology very carefully, but often not to introduce it at all. My sense is that these are busy listeners. Often they are not interested in becoming junior linguists. They just want to know about this thing called language that they use. And often helping them to understand it better means using concepts that are familiar to us as linguists. And those concepts, of course, come with labels. But sometimes I think the label is so opaque and so forbidding, you know, some Latinate or Greek word, that really to use it at all would be kind of like when you're watching a Shakespeare play and you haven't read it and somebody uses a word in a way that you think you understand, but you don't, and it's part of why the experience can be so forbidding. So, for example, over about the past maybe about 6 months on Lexicon Valley, without saying so, I've been trying to give the public a lesson in pragmatics, and how pragmatics is every bit as important as semantics in fully understanding language, that it's not something other that if you rolled the tape again, we would talk about pragmatics as much as we talk about semantics. I think really the fact that we are taught to think of pragmatic things as frills and as other really impedes a lot of understanding about all sorts of things about language, both sociological and not. I try so hard not to use the word pragmatics because we're all used to it, but think about how opaque that sounds to someone who isn't used to the way we use it. Pragmatic means practical, and that frankly has very little to do with anything that we talk about when we're using pragmatic. So I'll talk about softeners, I'll talk about hedging, I'll talk about whether something is old news or new news. I wouldn't say new information, new news and things like that, hot news. I'm not going to say pragmatics because frankly, they don't need to hear that term. I think I used it last week and I said, well, you know, unfortunately we call it pragmatics, but that helps nobody. Let's just move on. Really, what I'm interested in getting them to understand is the concepts. They can share those concepts at the party using normal English. And the terminology, I'm thinking often they can just get that if they want to take a linguistics class, because my idea is to try to change minds on all sorts of things. And to the extent that anything that we say will make somebody scratch their head or need to rewind, I figure let's not mess with the momentum. So I always try to think, how would I be hearing this when I was 14? And then I try to give it to them based on how that kid that I was would have wanted to hear it. But basically, what everybody else said, I agree. And am done.
Okay, thanks everybody. If we could have all of our panelists on camera now, we're come to the question and answer part of the webinar. So if you have your questions, please ask them using the questions widget in your on your GoToWebinar dashboard. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. We'll give you just a minute to start asking your question. Okay, here's a questions just come in. I've forwarded it to all of you.
Okay, so it looks like the question is, how much should I expect to spend to start a podcast? And I need to turn that over to somebody else because I am on National Public Radio, and so I have an infrastructure for the podcast, which is a real, it's a privilege for me to have that. And so can someone else take that question?
So we spend $12 a month. So we started out, my co-host was a student at NYU. So we were using space there. And now we record on her very nice equipment that I think she spent about $1,500 on, but she's a journalist as a career. And we record in a room just like this at a WeWork. So I spend $12 a month for hosting.
You can literally do it for free
Yeah.
if you want. There's ways to do it for free. So for example, Anchor is free. But usually most people pay for hosting. We used to, we don't anymore. We pay for our website. It's good to have a website, but you can have a free one. So that can be free. The way that we record our guests, we do it over Skype, but then we each record our own audio. And the reason we do that is because it sounds better. And there are some instances where our guests are just not tech savvy enough, or they're on the res or something, and they just don't have the access to the kind of thing they would need. And so in that case, we have to work around that. But because we do it that way, that's all free. There are, so Zencastr, for example, is free if it's just 2 people, but as soon as you have a 3rd person, you start having to pay per month for recordings. There's like editing software. So my husband is a graphic designer, so we have like everything. So for me, it's free. And there are free options for that. But so like it's really easy to buy like a very expensive microphone. But when you're first starting, maybe that's not necessary. You want the sound to be at least listenable, but it doesn't have to be broadcast quality as long as your content is good. At least some people will listen. So there's some people who are like very audio driven and they will only listen to like the best audio. Then there are people who are more content oriented, and you're never going to please everyone anyway. So anyway, there's so many costs, but a lot of ways to make it as cheap as possible. A really cheap mic that's like halfway decent, headphones, a computer that you already have, hopefully. Yeah.
One thing about, go ahead.
Michelle, I was just going to say very quickly, Slate backs mine completely. I just stepped into a job someone else had been doing before, so I'm useless here. Go ahead, Michelle.
John, we're not seeing your cam. Are you able to turn it on?
I see myself. Let me see. Okay, I turned myself back on. Am I there now? Yeah? No?
No.
Well, we've got your voice at least, so.
Okay, I'm gonna hit this. Oh, I got it. I know what it is. How about now?
Wonderful.
Okay, there.
Just one other thing to add about free and low cost is if you have an iPhone, quite honestly, an iPhone and a pair of headphones in a small room. And when I say small room, I kind of mean if you can get your body in your closet. I live in New York City, I can't, so I have recorded in the bathroom. But the smallest room that you can find will
Under
make
a blanket
your audio
works
quality.
too.
Yep.
We don't do that because we are, interviewing guests. But if it was just me, I might do the blanket thing because you can like block out a lot of the audio that way.
Yeah. And headphones make a huge difference. Like recording into your iPhone, like just holding it to your mouth is not, you will not get the same quality as you get even with a cheap pair of headphones.
So I see we've got another question here, which is.
I don't.
Oh, I will read it. A podcast is a podcast is recorded. So how are you all getting questions from your audience and other feedback about what works?
Well, people just write to me because I say at the end of the show, write to us, please. And for some reason they do. And so it just comes over email. That's how I do it. I don't have live interaction on my show.
Yeah, we also get email from our website and also directly because we do say at the end of every episode, here's our email address, but some people don't listen, so they have to go to the website or they'll tweet at us. We don't get that many questions, a few on Facebook, but Twitter is a huge place for it. And that's something to consider is you need to find your social media because otherwise, how are people going to find you? There's like being found as a podcast is really hard. There's not really good discoverability yet. So having your niche, some kind of social media, Instagram. Some people are really huge on Instagram. I personally don't get it because I guess I'm too old for that. But anyway, that's how we get our questions.
We do Instagram.
I think all of it. I mean, so ours are coming in. So ours are coming in through the website. We also have a sort of ask a question, and they come in that way. And then some people, because I'm easily found on the web, my email address will just email me directly with a question. So, and I think once people hear on the podcast that you're responding to people's questions and you say, Josie wrote in with this question, then they realize that they could write in with a question and they might get on the radio too.
And how much do you get, if I may? How many questions do you get? I'm beginning to feel a little overwhelmed by the amount. And a question could be, do you have somebody to help you answer the questions? Do you find that after a while?
Yeah, we probably get, so we get 3 to 5 questions a week, probably. And I will say, I have had to, they go into a centralized thing and I don't answer them all. I have to see them as suggestions for the podcast and that it may or may not get on the radio, but I can't, because some of them require research. And so I can't actually go find out the answer every week and respond to all the questions.
You're making me feel a little better because my general sense is that I'm actually going to answer all these questions. And frankly, it's not just 5 a week and it's beginning to stack up. And I'm beginning to think, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to all these. I shouldn't admit that in public, but yeah, maybe I should ease up.
It's not possible to answer all the questions.
It isn't? Okay.
Right? I mean, there's infinite questions. So you could also, like, maybe you have a question that you don't want to answer. Maybe you could farm it out to one of the other linguistic podcasts.
I might think about that.
That's a good idea.
Getting to that point.
I'm happy to like pass on any ones to you guys if I get something I don't want to answer, for sure.
Maybe.
And if anybody wants to talk to you about emojis and dating, please send them to us.
you are going to get a few, Michelle. Yeah.
Thank you. And we are really active on Instagram. We do a story almost every day. We post, the post creates a grid. My co-host is a millennial and has taught me so much about how to maximize the Instagram algorithm.
So is mine, but she doesn't like it either. So, I mean, like, for posting pictures, we're both okay with that. But anyway, yeah, I need a younger millennial, I guess.
So here's another question. I'm just like throwing out the questions as I see them come up here. So what would your advice be to someone wanting to pitch you an idea? So Carrie, maybe we could start with you because you are interviewing people on your show, and John, you are too sometimes.
Yeah, so sometimes people come to us and say, hey, I'd like to be on your show. And I think every single person that's asked has actually fit with our raison d'etre. Like we actually wanted them on the show. We haven't had someone ask that we thought, uh-oh, I don't know if they would fit with what we're doing. So if you just want to pitch, just try. I mean, what's the worst that you can say is no. Make it fit. So obviously for us, some kind of vector for discrimination that has to do with language, but that's really broad. So that's pretty easy to fit almost anyone into. For someone else, it might be something more, maybe something different. As long as it fits, I think you'll probably find that most people need more content. So they're happy to have more guests on. Maybe not with Lexicon Valley, maybe that's more busy, but.
No, I get asked, and generally my idea is, does the person have something that the audience would connect to? And sometimes the answer to that is no. And in all of those instances that I can think of, I found it very interesting, but I couldn't see a way of getting 40 minutes that the public would want to hear out of it. And so one has to be gentle about that. But yeah, one does. I mean, frankly, the interview shows take no effort. I mean, yes, you get your bullet points together, you read the book, but that's a lot easier than doing the whole 40-minute performance that I usually do. But I try to make it so that the audience will connect to whatever it is. And I had to learn that. I had to get my sea legs on that sort of thing. But yeah, and frankly, people should pitch because there's a critical mass of people today who would rather listen, and I mean really bright, engaged, literate people who would rather listen than read. And so if you want to get to people under about 40, I would think, you want to get on some podcasts. And I think that what we do is a venue for that.
Yeah, even I found I prefer listening now. I used to be an avid reader, and then I don't know, I got burnt out. And so now almost everything I do, besides, stuff reading on the internet, is mostly listening. So.
That's normal now, yeah.
It's hard to read and walk.
Right. I used to do that, but now I don't have to.
Awesome.
I've heard 2 podcasts in my whole life, and I only episodes, and I only listened to them about 3 weeks ago in a hotel room. It was the very first time, including, yes, my own. It was a very interesting experience. I need the page. I said that as a transition, and I don't know what.
Okay, so I think somehow mine cut out there for a minute, but the question was, how does one get from get a podcast from self-published to distributed via Slate or NPR? Can anyone be helpful here? I have to admit, I'm not helpful here. I started on NPR. I mean, they asked me to do that little slot, so I didn't have to, I wasn't self-publishing before it got picked up.
And Slate already had Lexicon Valley going with the person who's now my producer, Mike Volo. He did it with Bob Garfield for a few years.
Right.
Then I just came in. So all of that had already happened. I do know that Mike had to work hard to get Slate to accept this. It was a process that I didn't participate in, unfortunately.
Lyceum reached out to us.
Same.
Yeah. So we had put ourselves on Patreon, and we had one Patreon donator who we did not know, which was very exciting. But we're hoping with Lyceum we'll get more visibility, but it took about a year. So we have one season and we just finished recording our second season. And that was about a year's worth of episodes.
Yeah.
So here's a question, sort of a general question, which is why and how did you start podcasting? So Carrie, you want to start?
Sure. So 2.5 years ago, I decided it was actually almost 3 years ago now, I had this idea. Hey, look, I actually have something to talk about. Because, I'm a formal semanticist. Like, who wants to listen to a podcast about lambdas? Nobody. So
You'd have to be, you could do it carefully. Yeah.
you could do it carefully, but it'd be very niche. And I wanted to reach more people rather than fewer people. So I thought, what's something that I actually really care about? Well, I also really care about indigenous languages. I care about language diversity. I care about languages mattering. And I realized, linguistic discrimination is actually what I can talk about that the most people will understand and appreciate and see, oh, yes, we're all guilty of this. It's a human thing that we all do. So I just had that idea, and then luckily my husband was already producing some podcasts, and so he helped me get up to speed, because it is not an easy process to go from not doing any podcasting to everything. Like, I now edit everything, so I didn't originally, but now I do all the editing, and it's a lot of work. So you do have to, I don't know, baby step your way to it and have some help, ask a million questions of people like us, for sure.
Michelle?
Yeah, so I wrote a dissertation a few years ago, and it's been downloaded, a couple thousand times. I'm quite proud of that. But
That's good.
Wow, that's very good.
That's over a couple of years, but still. So
mine could live out there for so many years and it would never be downloaded.
I think
I would just like,
3 people have read my dissertation. Yeah.
But it doesn't have text messaging in the title. I mean, it might only be that 3 people have actually read mine too. It's just been downloaded. But I knew that more people would get some of the insights from it if I created a podcast. And at the time, I was doing a lot of work on texting and dating. That's about half of the academic work I still do, is like how language has changed in response to the proliferation of online dating. And different, we don't need to go down that route. But so I was doing a lot of interviews for Elite Daily, because they were reaching out to me, because I don't know if you are an avid reader of Elite Daily, but if you ever have a question about how dating in general, Elite Daily will probably have your answer. And they interview a lot of people who are experts in various topics. So I was doing a ton of interviews with Elite Daily, and the woman I was interviewing with, one day I was like, would you ever be interested in a podcast? And she had been looking for a long form project. So I really contribute the research and the ideas and the topics, and she contributes playing dumb, which she's so not, and doing all of the editing and the producing. So I was looking for someone to help me get basically my dissertation into a digestible format.
I think my answer on this is a little cynical and a little glib, I guess. Actually, with Lexicon Valley, originally, Mike Volo asked me if I wanted to participate. This was way back in 2010. and he was putting together this thing called a podding cast. And I didn't really know what that was. I had kind of heard the word, but back then I thought, I'm a writer and that's what I like doing. I don't want to work that hard at just a fancy way of being on the radio. And so I said, no, I'd rather not. And I felt bad for turning it down, but it didn't sound to me like anything real in June of 2010. And then time went by, and about 4 years ago, I realized that this podcast thing is now real, and that even if it seems alien to me, because I just like putting my eyes on a page, I could tell that that has now become my quirk, and that if I'm going to talk to people, I need to do this podcasting thing. And I realized that, well, if Mike is offering me this again, maybe I need to do it. And I, asked my kid's mother, I said, should I do this? And she said, yeah, this is what people do now. And so originally it was a summer trial thing, and I really thought it was only going to be for about 8 weeks, and it was all interviewing then. And after about 4 weeks, I started to notice from the way Mike was using adverbs and not saying things that this wasn't me doing it for the summer. This was a trial. And so finally, at the end of the summer, we talked about going on. And I told him, well, if we're going to keep doing this, I don't want to just interview, because that's only so much fun to do that every week. I would rather just kind of do my shtick. And I told myself I'm going to listen to some other podcasts and get a sense of how this goes, but I never really got around to it. So I started just going into the booth and spewing. Basically, I just pretend that I'm talking to my class. For some reason, that got passed. The sponsors did not run away. But the reason that I did it is because, frankly, I got tired of writing books that sell 9,000 copies. I just thought, I have no more books like that in me. There's no more point in writing those books. And I thought, I get the feeling with podcasts, you just reach more people. It's not about money. It's just that you get to change the world. That's why I did it. And now I'm sitting here, having now listened to 2 other podcast episodes. And I think I'll listen to another one. But at this point, it's just, I do what I do. And for some reason, it hasn't not worked. That's the answer.
Yeah, and I think I had started doing, more and more public work around linguistics, public lectures. John and I have both done courses for the Teaching Company, which is a kind of trying to reach a broader public with this, with linguistic information. So I was doing that work. I actually had gotten interviewed by Mike Volo for Lexicon Valley, and knew I enjoyed doing it. And then, this is where luck just happens. I was in a conversation with the head of Michigan Radio, and he was asking about what I do. And I get really excited when I talk about what I do, and I study the history of English. And he had said, I think we should think about having you on Michigan Radio. And at that point, I then had to pitch. They said, we have this 4-minute slot. It's across from Will Shortz. What would you do with it? And, I didn't think it was that hard to do, but I did have to make the pitch with some early ideas around, and I took low hanging fruit, like irregardless. If you talk about irregardless, that people are going to listen.
People love that. Yeah.
People love to hate it. It's, I pitched one about on accident, because that let me talk about young people changing the language. And I pitched one about the decline of the word must and shall, because that was one of those kind of surprising things of, here's a thing you probably haven't noticed is happening in the language, which is that must is falling out of use and have to's coming in. And and I had to show that I could do it in 4 minutes, that I could get across a certain amount of information in 4 minutes. But I do it for all the reasons that you all do it, which is I want to keep helping people think about language in a different way. And I can do that as a teacher. I can do it as a scholar, but I only reach a pretty small audience through academic publications. And so this is a way to reach more people. And I think it's really fun. I love the questions that come in. I find it delightful.
Agreed.
You know what,
So
Anne,
we have
actually, Great Courses is the transition in this. I always forget about that. I noticed that I got more mail about those than about the books.
Yep.
And so I thought there must be something about the ear. Yeah, that's what helped me realize that.
So it looks like we have one very specific question. What platform do we need to use to create a podcast?
The platform.
depends. I mean, you can use, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can use SoundCloud. Basically, you just need some place to put your content, and they will push it out to iTunes and Google Play and all the other ways that you can get your podcasts. So you just need something that will host it for you. And there are many, many, many podcast hosts out there, too many to list.
Google Podcast hosts, and pick the one that fits your budget and like what you're looking for.
Yeah, some of them have a lot better analytics than others. And if that's something that really is important to you, then make sure you get one that has really good analytics.
Yeah. Analytics meaning I put
Thank you.
Meaning, where are your listeners from?
Yeah. And some of them have demographics. I actually work in that kind of a space that uses those demographics and imputes those demographics. And, you know, we know roughly how old our listeners are, where they are, how many of them, if they downloaded or listened streaming, which is...
Yeah, we don't have that kind of information. We know where they're from, and that's about it. So it's not great.
But that's still pretty good.
Yeah, it's so cool. And you're like, hey, there's like 6 people in Ghana listening. That's kind of cool.
I'm going to find out my analytics. This is exciting.
I'm sure Slate is tracking them.
I'm sure they do.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to run. It's been lovely to participate with all of you, and I enjoy all of your podcasts. I'm now going to go put on my other hat, which is Dean of the College, and go try to manage some things that are happening on campus. So, but I hope people will pursue this space, whether it's pitching ideas to all of you or trying out their own podcast. There's so much to do in this space. There's so much information. I know all of us are trying to get out there, and the more voices, the better. There's a huge audience to reach, and each of us will reach them in a different way. So I appreciate all the people who participated in this webinar. So see you all later.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks so much for being here.
Try to have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks. And we'll continue with the rest of the panelists. There's another question here. Do you spend a lot of time answering emails from listeners?
I don't spend that much time. Go ahead, John.
I do. Yeah, I consider it part of being the host of it to answer as many of their questions as I can. And as we've discussed, it's getting to the point where the load is such that I need to rethink what I consider myself responsible for. But it's teaching, I guess. To me, it's just a different kind of teaching. And of course, the students are going to raise their hands. And you learn a lot from answering the questions, because the things people ask teach you what you could do better. They put a topic into your head, or sometimes you learn things that you hadn't thought about. So they really are a part of it. I would look forward to it if one was doing a podcast. The listener feedback is as much a part of the experience as you feeding the listeners.
Yeah, the reason why I say no is because we don't get that many. I try to respond to each one of them. And if it fits, we also talk about email on the show. So sometimes it's just like, hey, I just had this idea for a future show. Maybe you'd like to talk about this. I'll say, oh, okay, that's really cool, thanks. So that's a really quick thing. Sometimes it's more involved. And sometimes it's like really like, hey, this is a cool thing for people to think about. Let's also talk about it on the show.
And we don't have that kind of listenership. We get about 1 DM, 2 DMs a month. DM being a direct message on Instagram.
Okay.
Slide it into your DMs.
Yep, sliding. And we do talk about it on the podcast, because we talk about Instagram on the podcast, and dating via Instagram, don't do it.
I would be too scared.
Don't do it.
So there's another question here. Do you have recommendations for online checklists about how to start a podcast? There was a ton of stuff. Is there anything that you found particularly helpful?
Ooh, that's a good question.
That's a great question.
There is a ton of advice, and you're right, it's hard to filter through, because some places will tell you need this fairly expensive mic, and you need all this expensive equipment, and blah. And it's like, well, do you? Mostly no. Also, this is the thing. Podcasts are a creative space. You can do whatever you want. You will find an audience. It might be small, but you will find an audience. So maybe this is your time to just like ignore the checklist, other than, okay, you need some kind of host. It's good to have some kind of editing, although you don't have to, not everyone edits.
You need a host.
And you need someone to talk. Like, really, that's all you need. It's just like you and the internet. But other than that, like, why not try something different? Why not just see what works? You will learn more from doing, at least that's my experience, than from other people telling you what you absolutely have to do. I mean, other than like being open to feedback, that's another thing I would be.
Yeah. I would also say crowdsource your friends and whoever has skills that they want to contribute because they want more visibility. It's a very symbiotic relationship. Like our intro music is my co-host's cousin. He's like 16 and he made this like, and you know, we thank him at the end of every episode because he made this great intro music for us. And it's just one thing that he can put on a resume, I guess, to like apply to college. A dear friend made our logo, and I like love our logo, but she's also working on getting her artwork out to more eyes. So if you're just starting out, I would say crowdsource anybody who can do a piece for you, because it really creates this community and also expands your reach because they tell their friends, etc.
I get the feeling that it also helps, I say as somebody who doesn't listen to podcasts, to, if you're doing interviews, to at least start out with ones that are pretty cool, like maybe somebody prominent if you happen to be able to pull that off. But if not that, then just somebody who's really interesting, because people seem to enjoy that synergy, the idea that you had somebody on who they wanted to listen to. And maybe you don't always have to do that afterward. But I think if I had kept doing my Lexicon Valley as an interview show and there was just a person every week, when it would have taken off is when I had the linguist extraordinaire Deborah Tannen. People really liked that, and that would have given that show a big bump, even if by then I hadn't started just spewing most weeks. So that struck me, basically, that the interview part of it should have a certain snap, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, and picking a topic that people want to argue about is good. Like our first episode is about vocal fry, so, and for some reason our biggest episode is about Philly English. Who knew? Philadelphians love their accent. Yes.
Because they will jump onto it, right? Yeah. Who did you have as an interview for that, or need I ask?
Betsy Sneller.
Okay, she wrote that Pittsburgh book, or do I have that wrong? That's somebody else.
Maybe she also did that, but she lived in Philly and could talk about Philly.
No, there's somebody else who did it. Okay, yeah.
but she lived there and she did her work on Philadelphia, and so, yeah. And you just never know what's gonna like spark interest. So unfortunately, like there's no like one good answer. Yes, someone prominent will help. But sometimes it's just like this really random thing. Like I had no idea it was gonna be Philly English. Like what?
Yep. Our biggest episode's on emojis, but
yeah, of course.
I could have predicted that.
Yeah.
That's what
we
people
still
want.
need to have one on emojis, actually.
I'm not doing it.
No, you shouldn't. It's not a have to.
It would get lots of hits. It would get all those hits.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question, and I guess if this has happened ever to you on any of your podcasts, what if a guest linguist on your podcast starts using language that is too technical?
I stop them and I say, can you explain it? I mean, it happens not every single time. Almost every single interview, there's at least one piece of jargon that we're like, oh, can you explain that for our audience? Because no one's going to know what ergativity is or whatever. Yeah, we don't actually talk about that one, but it could happen at some point.
It's what comes to my mind most immediately, yeah. Actually, for that sort of thing, it hasn't happened often, but my strategy when someone does that is to say, I don't know what that means. And of course, the person knows I do know what it means, but it's my gentle way of saying, explain that to the audience. Or if the whole interview has involved a little too much of that sort of thing, then after the taping's over, I'll append something that's fun and fizzy. And because people tend to remember what was last rather than what was first, that gets the episode into being the standard flavor. I shouldn't say it, but I've done that twice. But yeah, in general, you just interject very gently because, not everybody knows that the world doesn't know what ergativity means or something like that.
We
And
haven't
usually
had that.
they're going to know. They're going to be like, oh, yeah, of course, I should explain this. Like, no one's mad.
Right. Exactly. Yeah,
They're
they understand when you jump in. Yeah.
As the resident linguist on our show, we don't have that problem. But the problem that we do have is people get way too intimate. And we're like, okay, we're keeping it PG-13. And we edit that out. We just cut it out completely. Anything that doesn't fit with what our vision of the show is. And we tell all of our guests. We tell all of our guests right up front. We edit really heavily for making it cohesive and making sure that it fits within the themes that we're trying to address. So everyone's aware that they're getting edited.
Yeah. I've never had to edit for that particular, obviously not for your problem, but also not for like too jargony. But there are definitely parts where I'm like, this is just going too far afield. It's not really like helping the conversation. So I'm going to cut this out. So yeah, editing is your friend.
I edit me sometimes. I'm like, can you just, I listen and I send it to my co-host and I'm like, can you just cut this piece? It doesn't fit.
Yeah. Same.
I do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll say I said something that could be taken the wrong way, or I thought this was funny and frankly it's not funny. And so I'll tell the producer, please just cut that out. Yeah, that has to happen.
Here's another question. In the academy, how should we evaluate public-facing work like podcasts for tenure promotion?
No, to me, they're completely separate. I mean, I think that if you do this job, it's something that you're doing on the side. And I wouldn't have expected, if I didn't have tenure yet, that this would be counted. Or it would have to be a different world where almost every non-tenured professor was also podcasting so that we were all being measured the same way. But I wouldn't have wanted to be given tenure out of a sense that, well, he has a podcast on Slate, whereas the woman next door to me is getting tenure based on having articles published in phonology and in language. They're really not the same thing to me. And I will say, and you two can correct me on this, you may feel differently. I would say podcasting to me is easier than writing academic articles. And I love both things, but they're different tasks. And so I don't feel bad that Columbia would not count that in terms of me getting promotions and things like that. But maybe I'm too hard on myself. I don't know. What do you two think?
I think it should count for something, but it should not be part of the academic side. So you've got your research track, you've got your administration track, you've got your teaching track, but somewhere you have like, hey, here's my public facing stuff. And universities do love that stuff.
They do.
So there should be a way of making your case should not hinge on it, right? But it should still be a plus in the column.
As someone who is geographically constrained and therefore not currently in a tenure track position at all, who is adjuncting and doing this, I don't think that my podcast should ever count as academic work. Now, I have 2 books under contract that are kind of on the edge, that are way more research heavy. And those are books, they are long form research projects, but this podcast should never count as research. Quite honestly, I don't hold myself to the same standard in the podcast that I hold myself to when I write journal articles.
I don't know if we're supposed to say that, but yeah.
Well, I mean, so what I mean by that is every episode I have at least one core article that I'm going to talk about. Like one piece of research that's legitimate research. I did not do a full literature review for every episode. I found one article, it fit, it worked really well, and I'm like, okay, that's all that I really need. I'm going to talk about this one study, but I'm not going to synthesize a bunch of different pieces to come together. So yeah, I don't think that they're the same thing.
No, they're not the same thing, but I still think you're giving attention to your school,
Hmm.
and so that
Yeah.
should count for something.
Yeah, it's still labor.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's labor. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, it's easier, but it's also time consuming. So it's like,
Mm.
it should still mean something. Just
Yeah.
don't know exactly what.
It's,
Yeah.
I would also, in a certain way, it's more fun, you
It's a
know?
lot more fun.
Like,
I love it.
yes.
I wish I
You know,
was getting paid more for this.
actually, to me, this is going to sound so canned, like I'm saying it for effect, but I really mean it. Writing an academic article to me is the most satisfying finishing the hat thing in the world. To write an article and have it go out there, it's exactly the way I wanted it. The tapeworm sentences, no one's going to read it, but for some reason, for me, that's just wow. I was born to do that. The podcast is the second nicest thing, you know, because it's jolly and you get the feedback. But to me, boy, if you could get paid to do that, and if people would actually read them, wow. But yeah, here in the real world, you have to do something other than that.
So where do you put your books?
Books.
Yeah, the books that you've written, the many, many books that many people have read. In that
Yeah.
hierarchy, where would you put your books?
Oh, that's the books are right below podcasting now because I finished a book chapter today. To finish a book chapter is also that feeling of here is why I'm alive. But then on the other hand, honestly, I feel like what with audio technology being the way it is, I write books now thinking, is anybody going to get to it? Because there are these podcasts and all these shorter things. And I'm writing a book now about profanity, and I'm writing it very carefully because it's the first book I'm writing where I'm thinking of myself reading it as the way most people are going to engage it. And so since it's about profanity, I find I'm writing some word, and you can imagine the words over and over, which looks fine on the page. Then I'm thinking, I can't say that word this often in audio because it's going to be grating, and I'm rewriting because I'm just thinking people are going to be listening to this walking down the street. So yeah, it's a different world. I used to like writing books more, I hate to say, but podcasting is a joy. Yeah.
I like writing books probably almost as much as the podcasting. It's really hard, and I hate it at first, but then once I get closer to the end, it's like really satisfying. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I like books more than podcasting.
Really?
Sure. Oh yeah.
That's interesting because it's permanent and you worked harder on it.
Yes. Yeah. And I feel more in control of making something beautiful.
Yes, it's true.
It's a vase. That is true. Yeah. That is definitely true. And
so
when people have read it, yeah.
So the two books I'm working on now are literally that is the joy of my day. And the podcasting's the second. Don't ask me about teaching.
When somebody walks up to never mind.
So here's a question from someone who says, I get so many ideas and new information from my students. How many ideas should I have before starting a podcast?
Oh, you have enough.
Yeah, we had one basic one. And then we decided, okay, we should have some future topics maybe that we can talk about before we actually launch. But it just really takes one good idea to start. And once you get going, you're like, oh, this.
Or you might consider, it's kind of like how British television, they have just, a few short seasons, and that's sometimes better than having the 15 seasons of How I Met Your Mother or however many they did. I think maybe you have something that's worth 12 shows and you just do it. I'm telling many people now who say, how can I write books like you? I say, don't write a book, do a podcast, and say it's like 15 well-wrought shows that you put out there. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't have to do 100 episodes of anything. I think that's a valid way of getting your ideas out there these days.
Absolutely. Lots of podcasts are either more like a mini series, right? You have your 5-6 episodes and you're done, or they have short seasons, like let's say maybe 12 episodes a season, maybe less, but they do know eventually they'll have a second season. They just haven't figured out what that's going to be about. So they're just going to focus on one at a time. Ours is more like whatever we decide to talk about, so it doesn't really matter. But again, you can do what you want. It's your podcast.
That too, yeah. It's true.
I've been toying recently with the idea of basically doing a class as a podcast in a
Mm-hmm.
like 14 to 16 week set of lectures. I'm really
That's the future.
obsessed with the idea of doing data visualization because it sounds like the hardest thing that I teach to turn into a podcast. So
In
something
audio, right?
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. No,
Yeah.
no visual. But how to condense that, and if you're getting ideas from your students, I'm sure you have enough to start a podcast.
You definitely do.
Students are the
Yep.
best.
Yep.
And you have more ideas than you think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just said you have more ideas than you think. Because you think, oh, maybe this is all, I only have 2 ideas and I'm done. It's not going to be the case.
You're going to have more. Yeah, definitely.
So here's a related question. Someone says, I'm planning to have my undergrad students create a podcast collaboratively. Any advice?
Cool.
Send it to me.
Oh, also, go back to the conversation about Lyceum. It's basically for any academic or academic adjacent podcast. So if you are planning an academic type podcast, you can probably just email the organizers of that of Lyceum, and they'll probably just want you to be on the
Yeah, reach out
network.
to them.
Yeah.
You know what? I had to adjust to that when I heard it, thinking there's a new way to approach undergraduate teaching. But no, I get it. Actually, that would be a great way of teaching young people what used to be called oratorical training, getting your thoughts across, not necessarily in writing this 5-paragraph essay, but talking, because that's what we do now, talking well. And I certainly don't mean that it's supposed to sound like William Jennings Bryan or something like that, but to get it across for the ears of people who are not your friends. That's an art. I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. If I had continued teaching, I probably would have incorporated podcasting eventually into my classroom, because I think, yeah, it's a really great skill. Everyone needs to know how to talk and convince people of their ideas.
The one piece of advice I like thinking about this, I want to adopt it into my classes, but yeah, I don't teach these kind of classes anymore. No one's going to do data analysis as a podcast. But I would give them such strict boundaries, because you're asking them to go into a very uncharted territory. And what I mean by strict boundaries is what you actually want them to achieve, which seems so obvious because we've all created rubrics and things like that. But the more constrained that you make it, sometimes the more creative projects can come out of it. If you don't want a 2-hour podcast, tell them that it needs to be whatever length you want it to be, And if you don't want it under a certain length, I would give them those very practical boundaries, which I don't give my students word limits anymore. I say, as many words as you need to cover the topic. But it's such a familiar medium to them in an academic context, whereas podcasting is so not in an academic context. So I would give them very, very clear guidelines more than anything else, but you probably already knew that if you're asking the question.
Yeah, probably shorter is better, just because it's really easy to ramble.
Yeah.
And shorter is harder.
Part of good talking is short. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also sharpens your ideas. So
it does.
Just like with writing, a really long thing can be really bad, but 2 paragraphs can be really great. So
shorter is better. Yeah.
Thanks. And we're about 4 minutes away from the end, and we have one last question. So that timing is working out. We've also had a couple of people who've written to say a huge thank you to everybody, which I will echo in a moment when we sign off. But the last question here is, how long did it take you to feel comfortable or at ease in this realm?
About 6 months, I guess.
I'm probably speaking for Ann Curzan too. If you've done those great courses where they put you into a booth and you talk and you can't use a script, that's your rehearsal. And I had been doing that for a very long time. And I kind of like to teach people stuff. I was doing it when I was like 4. And so to tell you the truth, right from the beginning, I just thought, I'm teaching, except I'm in this uncomfortable room. and I might as well be talking to my students. And I didn't think of it as I shall now be podcasting, but that's probably partly because I didn't listen to podcasts, but I just thought I'm teaching, and I had done it before. How long did it take me to get comfortable doing the great courses? Remembering, no time at all, again, because I thought this is teaching. How long did it take for me to get comfortable teaching? I had to have a swig of gin before I first stood up in front of a class as a TA. And that worked, and I found that I wasn't not accepted. And after that, I would just get up there and teach them because it was my passion. But the first time, yeah, I needed liquor. But that's the question. But I was long past that by the time I got into the booth to do Lexicon Valley.
I do not listen to myself. I'm completely fine recording the episode, and I cannot tolerate listening to recorded episodes or watching interviews with myself. Every interview I do that's print medium, I'll read that. That's fine. I cannot do. I still.
Why? Why?
It is really weird listening to your own voice. It took me a long time to get over it, but it was pre-podcasting because I was doing field work, so I was recording myself and like I had to listen to the tapes and like get the data. So I got kind of used to listening to my voice, and I became less annoyed with myself. And now I edit, so it's still annoying me, but it's not as bad as it could be. So that part, but my co-host had never done anything like this before, so for her, I know she was more nervous about recording, and you just kind of get over it at some point. You're just like, oh, okay, now I just talk, and that's okay. Plus we can edit, so if we say something that's not great, cut.
You know what would help, actually, I would say, is that if you have a producer, if you are in a booth somewhere as opposed to in a closet, which actually I would find very comfortable to do it in my bedroom closet. But if you're in a studio, it helps to have somebody across the glass who you feel pretty comfortable with. I find that it's nice for that engineer to, if they're listening to you, to be enjoying it, or if they don't care, to kind of turn away. I'm a little sensitive to that aspect of environment. It would have thrown me if I wasn't comfortable with the person on the other side of the glass, even after having done the great courses, etc. And I don't know how much control you always have over that, but that is something. But it was more that than being just afraid of the microphone, like somebody back in old radio or something like that. It depends on what you bring to it, I guess.
Okay, well, it is almost 2:30, and it looks like we're out of questions from the audience. So just a huge thank you again to all of you, and to Anne for taking the time out of your afternoon to be here and for sharing your expertise with us. And many thanks to all of you in the audience too for taking the time out of your day to be with us. Also look for a webinar in the coming weeks from the hosts of the LSA's own podcast, which is called Subtitle. So we'll have a recording of this webinar available soon, possibly this afternoon, or more likely by Monday, and we will let you know when it is ready. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.